Chairman, and I certainly want to thank Director General Sisota and the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis for inviting me to this conference. It's not only a lovely venue you have here, but I've been very impressed over the first day with the caliber of not only the intellect, but the experience that you've been able to bring together to discuss security issues. So it's a real honor to be a part of that. What I'd like to do is briefly go over some analysis I've done on Indian missile defense and try to give you a flavor for some of the analysis, as well as discuss some of the strategic implications that I believe missile defense might have. What I've listed here are some objectives for missile defense in general, but specifically for Indian missile defense. First of all, it matters against whom the missile defense is directed, whether it is really meant for Pakistan or China. Not only because the objectives that China and Pakistan have for nuclear weapons differ, but also the sophistication of the ballistic missile threat against which the system has to operate will differ. The first set of objectives I call political objectives. Missile defense can have an important role in politics. One of them here, the first one I've labeled as providing an antidote to the rhetoric of nuclear first use. I'll quoting Manpreet Sethi here, who used the phrase, at least I read it first in a paper she wrote, existential defense, as opposed to existential deterrence, by which I mean a system, a capability that may not be fully proven, that is out there in the field, that provides some sort of defensive capability against an adversary. It could be potentially very politically useful. It could be politically useful for leaders to have that type of defense, so that when a country like Pakistan rattles the nuclear saber, India would rattle the nuclear or the missile defense as a rhetorical counter. It could help reassure the public in the midst of a crisis. There are other political objectives like prestige, economic spin-offs that have been mentioned for various types of technology. Certainly these were discussed when nuclear technology, civilian nuclear power technology was spreading around the world. Personally, I don't think that either the prestige or the economic spin-offs associated with missile defense are all that great. Or to put it another way, I certainly would not be investing large sums of money in missile defense purely for those objectives, lacking a real concrete military objectives. If economic growth is what a country is interested in, there are a lot of other ways to stimulate economic growth besides investing in systems like missile defense. Even countries like the United States are interested in economic growth these days, so missile defense would not be the way to stimulate that. Military objectives, of course, are the most important, and I've divided them into two categories: those that would require point defenses, defenses of a very small area, versus area defenses. Point defenses, you could protect the nation's capital, important economic centers, Mumbai, facilities like that, locations like that. An important objective is to protect the top political and military leadership, especially the leadership that has responsibility for the control of Indian nuclear forces, the so-called National Command Authority. You can protect important conventional military bases, ports, airfields, logistics nodes, etc. But in fact, if you want to protect conventional military assets, in my mind, the best way to do that is not with point defense, but rather area defense, the first tick there under the heading of area defense. And the reason is because you can use preferential defense tactics. What do I mean by preferential defense? If you have a broad area defense, the attacker does not know how the defense interceptors are allocated. He does not know which assets might be defended more heavily than others. And so as a consequence, the attacker has to pile up the weight of the attack against all possible targets to really have high confidence that they can destroy, say, half of the airfields, half of the ports, or whatever. And you get substantial leverage when you use preferential defense tactics. One of the most important military bases or assets really is the Indian nuclear forces. This I put under the heading of area defenses because point defenses, I think, are singularly inappropriate in the Indian context for defending India's nuclear forces. The reason being that my understanding is the survival of Indian nuclear forces are based on mobility, covert locations, and once they are out in the field, if they can be located, they may be fairly vulnerable, especially to nuclear weapons effects. So if I have a point defense whose radius of effectiveness is maybe 30 kilometers, and that defense asset's running around with my mobile missiles, I'm essentially advertising to my adversary where my nuclear assets are located so they can focus their surveillance assets in that region and have a much better chance of localizing and finding the nuclear assets. So for the defense of India's nuclear forces, area defense is what would be required. An important objective, I should say that this defending nuclear assets obviously is enhancing the deterrence, so that's your ultimate objective, is to enhance deterrence. The way you do that is to protect nuclear assets. Along lines with the existential defense, the political objective is the military objective of reducing the utility of limited nuclear threats, again in the Pakistani context, making it more difficult for small, limited nuclear threats to appear credible. And defenses do that by essentially forcing the attacker to increase the size of their attack. They have to increase the weight of the attack to try to get through a thin defense, which makes it much more problematic if the attacker intends to keep the conflict limited. So that can be a potentially very useful military role. And finally, protecting broad area population centers and the like from both intentional as well as accidental unauthorized launch. So these are a set of objectives. I've already highlighted some that I think are particularly important, and I'll come back to these at the end of the talk. I want to point out, though, that most of the objectives require area defense, not point defense. And that's important, I think, because most of the current generation Indian missile defense programs tend to be point defense systems, and so they're not particularly appropriate for this, many of these objectives. Once you decide on the objectives you think are important, one has to decide the size of the defense, thick or thin, and that has implications for how likely the adversary would be to respond to your defense. I note here in the bottom that ballistic missile defense is not synonymous with nuclear defense. It's only one delivery mode, happens to be the one delivery mode that India currently cannot protect against, but a comprehensive defense against nuclear attack is both air and missile. And finally, a note, at least in the American debate, a lot of people talk about the role of missile defense is to provide deterrence by denial, a phrase which I do not find very useful. It sort of comes out of the Cold War, where the most important objective of U.S. strategic forces was deterrence. And so anything that had to do with deterrence was by definition good. And so when defenses came along, people said, well, this enhances deterrence, deterrence by denial, not deterrence by punishment. But I think that misses an extremely important point. Deterrence by denial tries to influence the adversary's decision to attack a certain asset because he may believe that it's too hard to penetrate the defense. And so he instead goes after a softer target. It is true that defenses can have that function, but the real purpose of defenses, in my mind, is not to influence the adversary's intentions or influence which targets they want to attack. It's to protect targets regardless of the adversary's intentions. You want to protect your assets independent of what the adversary is thinking. And that's precisely why defenses have become of interest in the American debate. People have started questioning the efficacy of deterrence, especially when applied to countries like Iran or North Korea. And so if you're nervous about whether a strategy that fundamentally relies on influencing your adversary's calculus, then defenses are attractive because they provide protection, potentially, if they work, regardless of the intentions or the internal deliberations or calculations or misperceptions of your adversary. So defenses provide protection, first and foremost. They do. Deterrence by denial, I think, is a real effect, but it's not one that I would spend a lot of time on. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about defense effectiveness. There are three ingredients that go into making an effective defense. The first is how big an area can the defense architecture protect? How big an area on the ground can be protected, the so-called defense footprint. This is a complicated function of the targets that it's trying to shoot at, the sensor architecture, the radar architecture, the interceptor characteristics, and I'm going to show you in a minute some simulations I did where I fold all the physics of these things in to calculate how big an area of Indian territory can be defended with different defense architectures. The next important ingredient is what's the probability you can actually successfully destroy or intercept a warhead? This has two pieces. First, what's the probability that I can discriminate or determine which is the warhead from other objects that are coming at me? And remember that when a ballistic missile is launched, if it's a separating warhead, you'll have the warhead, but you also have the upper stage, the last stage of the ballistic missile, which is also coming at you at the same speed, and it's part of this cluster of objects that the radar or other sensors are looking at. So there are other objects up in the so-called threat cluster, and you have to determine which is the warhead. That can be made more complicated if the adversary tries to produce decoys, which actually try to help conceal the location of the warhead. So first you have to discriminate which object is the warhead. Once you've discriminated it, then you have to be able to hit that object with high probability. In the current technologies that the Americans are working on, the first problem still is problematic, the probability of discriminating warheads from other objects. I will not say that it can't be done. It depends on how sophisticated the decoys are. It can certainly discriminate, the American systems can discriminate warheads from upper stages and a lot of other objects. The piece of the problem that is working very well from a technical point of view is the second one. Once you determine what the object is, you can hit it with very high probability. And that's a very impressive accomplishment when you consider the speeds with which these objects are coming at each other, 20,000 miles an hour or whatever. These hit-to-kill interceptors are working, I think, very well. Well, once you determine the area that can be protected, and if you convince yourself you have a high probability of actually intercepting the warhead, then the third element of an effective defense is how big it is, its size, relative to the offensive threats it's supposed to handle. And again, it could be either limited in size or it could be large. The analysis that I've looked at most closely is the first one, the footprint. I can talk about the probability of successful intercept, but I'll leave that to Q&A if people have questions about how effective these systems might be. Here's the Indian picture as best I understand it, and I am a student of this. I've only read some literature, so I may be missing some important ingredients. But currently the Indian program, they're looking at a two-layer defense, the Advanced Air Defense Interceptor, a low-altitude interceptor, and the Prithvi Air Defense System, which is a higher altitude. Both of these are interceptors that work within the atmosphere, so-called endo-atmospheric interceptors. There are plans in the next year or so to start investigating more sophisticated interceptors. None of these are deployed systems. They're all in the test stage. On top of that, India has been entertaining the possibility of purchasing systems from abroad, mostly point defense systems like the Arrow, the Russian systems, the PAC-3. They have purchased a Green Pine radar from Israel, a very good radar. But in general, the systems that India is currently developing or is thinking of purchasing are likely to be inadequate for the kinds of objectives that I talked about on that first slide. So to look at a broader area defense, one has to look at more powerful radars, in particular a long-range early warning radar if China is of concern, as well as higher speed interceptors. And I've shown some here, the THAAD, about a 3-kilometer-a-second interceptor, the Standard Missile Block 2, not the current version, the next one that's being built in collaboration with Japan is about a 4.5-kilometer-a-second interceptor. And I'll show you the impact that these systems have. Here's a picture of the Green Pine radar. Again, very sophisticated radar. If I put this at Hindon Air Force Base, this shows you the area that can be covered by the radar. As you can see, it's perhaps a little hard on this picture, but the surveillance fan and even the tracking capability of the radar extends well out over Pakistan. So any missile launches coming out of Pakistan can be detected by this radar fairly easily. If I look at that same radar pointed out towards China, here's a bunch of IRBM, intermediate range ballistic missile bases in China, Jiangshui, Dalinghua, Tiandam, Tangtao. As you can see, the radar just simply doesn't see far enough out over China. This presents a problem because if I look at it side on, here is a green pine radar at Allahabad over in eastern central India. This is the detection range of the radar here. As you can see, when the radar scans the horizon looking for missiles coming up through the radar fence, it doesn't see a DF-3 launch from Jiangshui because that missile climbs so high in the outer space that it essentially flies over the radar. And so this radar will never detect that missile coming. So if a defense against China is required, one has to look at long-range early warning radars of the sort that the United States deployed in the 50s and 60s, the pave pause radar. That thing is, the radar face is 30 meters, 22 meters, something like that, about 70 feet high. And this is a Russian radar, the Voronezh type early warning radar, VHF radar, which is also a fairly good early warning radar. Both of these would be candidates. The Americans have proposed selling the pave pause at one time to Taiwan. I'm not sure about whether Russia would export that, but it's probably a cheaper version if India was seriously considering purchasing an early warning radar from abroad. This is what the radar coverage would look like. In this case, it's a pave pause radar I used to generate this picture. I put the radar at Gwalior in central India, and here's the radar fan from the pave pause. It extends way out over China, and here's that same DF-3 trajectory. You see it coming up. It comes up through the bottom of the radar, the surveillance fan. It would be tracked by the radar, and then the early warning radar hands that track data off to these green pine or a THAAD radar to actually do the fire control. So this is the kind of radar architecture one needs if you're looking at a defense against China. Actually, it'd be very useful for India to have that kind of radar for early warning, just for attack characterization. How many warheads are in the attack? What's the timing? What are the likely targets? That kind of information is extremely valuable to the National Command Authority, even if you're not interested in missile defense. So that asset, I think, would be particularly important. Okay, well, let me turn to how well these systems can protect India. This is a picture of the Prithvi defense. Maybe a little hard to see it, but this footprint here, the shaded area, is the area on the ground that could be protected from Gauri missiles launched from this location in Pakistan. The range of the Gauri is 1,300 kilometers. The AAD, the Advanced Air Defense, is a little circle about 50 kilometers or so in diameter. That's that smaller circle around Hindan Air Force Base, and this is the larger footprint. So the Prithvi Air Defense is actually what I would call a limited area defense. It's not a point defense, but it certainly does not have the capability for broad defense of India. If I start looking at some of these other architectures where you have higher speed interceptors, like THAAD, the footprint associated with THAAD is this shape in here. Now you can see that you're protecting huge chunks all the way out to the maximum range of the Gauri 1. And if I increase the interceptor speed to 4.5 kilometers a second, the speed associated with the Standard Missile 3, now one interceptor site, in this case around New Delhi, essentially covers the entire area of India within range of the Gauri 1. If I look at other missile threats like the Shaheen, a 2,000 kilometer range missile, same story unfolds. This smaller footprint in here is the Prithvi Air Defense. This is the THAAD-like defense, 3 kilometers a second, and this is the 4.5 kilometers a second. So if I increase the interceptor speed to 4.5 kilometers a second, I can defend the entire area of India within range of missiles. The same story holds if I now look at China. Now again, I have to have the early warning radar, the pave pause radar in the architecture, but these footprints, that's the 5-minute warning. Jeez, it goes fast. Suffice it to say that the 4.5 kilometer second interceptor basically covers almost all of India out to the maximum range of the DF-3 with perhaps Assam in some areas might be outside the coverage. And the same with the DF4. Here's the THAAD footprint. The inner one, the 4.5 kilometer second footprint is huge, going all the way out to the maximum range of the DF4 in this case. So, because I think Pakistan is on people's minds in India with respect to a rationale for Indian missile defense I want to look at, one of the responsive threats that Pakistan might be able to implement that could cause the defense some problem and how the defense would have to handle it. Depressed trajectories. Anytime you launch a ballistic missile to a range less than the maximum range, that extra energy can either be used to loft the missile or to depress it, fly it on a lower apogee trajectory. Depressed trajectories tend to fly faster, they come in faster, and as you can see, their maximum altitude is lower. If I ask what is the footprint of, now I'm going to use the fast interceptor, the 4.5 kilometer second interceptor. What's the footprint associated with the fast interceptor against depressed trajectories? Well, here's the minimum energy trajectory from before, the one that covered all of India within range of the Gowrie-1. The depressed trajectory footprint is this little slice back here. The footprint essentially collapses dramatically, which is to say, depressed trajectories launched from this launch location here towards Delhi, I cannot defend with this system that's actually located right near Delhi at Hindan. The reason for that is very simple once you know what it is, and that is there is a minimum intercept altitude for these interceptors. That is to say, they don't operate below a certain altitude in the atmosphere. For the Standard Missile 3, that happens to be 100 kilometers. In other words, if the trajectory is below 100 kilometers, the interceptor has no chance of carrying out the intercept because the sensors are blinded by the atmospheric heating. And so, as you notice here, the Gowrie-1 1,300 kilometer range missile launched against a target that's 950 kilometers away, that trajectory just barely gets up to 100 kilometers in altitude. If it's below that, the defense can't even shoot at it. And that's precisely why this picture, all the trajectories launched from here towards targets in here, they never climb above 100 kilometers. So how does the defense respond to that? You have to develop an interceptor with a lower minimum intercept altitude, like the THAAD interceptor, which is 40 kilometers. And now if I put THAAD, I move it closer to the border. Here are the depressed trajectory footprints. If I really push the minimum intercept altitude down to 30 kilometers, I can move it a little further forward. So now I can protect Delhi and major urban areas closer to the Pakistani border. But two things. First, it's very hard to protect that first 200 kilometers of territory from the Pakistani border with any missile defense. Second, the missile defense site itself is unprotected. So it has to be protected with another asset like PAC-3, a point defense asset. Otherwise, it's vulnerable to attack. Okay, that's a little bit of a flavor for the capability. How much do these systems cost? The short answer is a lot. $2 to $4 billion for a thin system, and I've shown some of the characteristics. More robust system, they could easily get to $10 to $20 billion. Here's, for the purpose of comparison, some of the systems. The European system that's proposed for the Czech Republic, Poland, that's $3.5 billion for 10 interceptors, 1 large radar, and operating support costs, base construction, things like that. The Japanese system, 4 Aegis cruisers, a bunch of PAC-3 fire units, and a couple of radars, one which is new and others that are being upgraded, $5 billion. A proposed sale to the United Arab Emirates, $7 billion for 3 THAAD batteries, quite a large number of interceptors, and an extra THAAD radar, the forward-based X-band radar, it's a THAAD radar. So these systems tend to be quite expensive, even for thin systems. When I look at this analysis, what do I take away from it? Well, first is that I think a nationwide defense of India is possible against Pakistani and Chinese threats. Even one, I didn't go into all the different responses, but I showed you the depressed trajectories. That forces you to deploy batteries far forward with low intercept altitudes like THAAD. So the system tends to get more expensive. I didn't look at decoys, but a similar story pertains there, where now you have to deploy high-power X-band radars like the European mid-course radar. an expensive $500 million radar. So you can respond to these kinds of threats, but it tends to be expensive. That's what drives you up to the $10 to $20 billion range. High-speed interceptors are key, 4.5 kilometers a second. But those depressed trajectories, you need an interceptor that has a low minimum intercept altitude. Green Pine's a good radar. You need an early warning radar if the system is to be directed against China. And you're going to need X-band radars, either the THAAD or the European Midcourse radar, if you're up against low radar cross-section threats or decoys. The responsive threats, I mentioned the depressed trajectories from Pakistan. That forces you to a THAAD-like system or potentially boost phase defense if you want to get more exotic about the defensive responses. The reduced radar cross-section would be the high-power X-band radars. So I want to come back now to some of the strategic implications, because after all, that was the title of my talk, and as much as I like to talk about technology and capabilities, there are a lot of interesting issues having to do with the strategic impact of this kind of defense. First, again, the political impact. I do think that such a system, even a thin system, would provide a rhetorical counter to nuclear saber rattling that may be attractive to some political leaders. I think such a system could be used to increase the survivability of Indian nuclear forces. Not that they're vulnerable today, but it's an extra layer of assurance to protect the retaliatory capability. I think the system would also be used to reduce the utility of threats to cross the nuclear threshold first. And largely that's because it increases the size of attack that the opponent has to consider to get through the defense. It makes it much more risky, I think, for somebody to contemplate crossing the nuclear threshold with 5 or 10 missiles as opposed to 1. It eliminates things like demonstration shots. If the nuclear threshold is crossed, missile defense actually may help control escalation after that point for 2 reasons. One, if the defense is successful and you actually, there's no need to escalate further. You can stop, at least India can pause and doesn't have to respond with a nuclear attack. It also helps, so it reduces the Indian necessity to retaliate. It also helps protect Indian capability to maintain control over its nuclear forces by protecting India's strategic command, control, and communication networks. If you don't have the capability to control escalation, it doesn't matter whether you have the intent to want to control escalation. It may spiral out of control despite your desires. So defenses may play an important role in controlling escalation if the nuclear firebreak is breached for whatever reason. An interesting example of that is against accidental and unauthorized launch. It's hard to conceive of if an unauthorized attack were launched by, say, Pakistan and it landed on Indian territory and the weapon went off. It'd be very hard not to respond, I would think, in some way, although how one responds is an interesting question. This is Mumbai 1,000 times greater. If you have a missile defense system that actually could intercept that missile and it's successful, then one doesn't have to respond. And so it can be very useful for preventing accidental and unauthorized scenarios from spiraling out of control. I would say that this does require both this impact as well as making retaliatory threats unnecessary. Though that is true only if the defense is effective. If the defense is not effective, it actually provides Pakistan with leverage. India deploys a thin defense, uses it for political purposes to try to decrease the likelihood that limited attacks might occur. Pakistan fires one missile. It penetrates the defense because it doesn't work. Now, all of a sudden, India realizes that its source of protection essentially vanishes instantly, that the confidence in missile defense was misplaced, and now Pakistan has a much greater ability to coerce India with subsequent missile threats. So one has to be careful. This can actually backfire in ways as well. Still, I think there are some interesting roles for missile defense. Finally, let me talk about strategic stability, because much of the discussion is about that. If The missile defense is thin. There may not be much of an incentive to react. I certainly don't think China would react if it's a thin system. They're already reacting to American missile defense systems. I'm not sure that Indian missile defenses would provoke that anymore. Pakistan, maybe they would react to such a defense. There are 4 generic types of response: build more missiles or put more warheads on missiles, deploy countermeasures, decoys, all that sort of stuff. Suppress the defenses, jam or physically attack the defense assets, or deploy other delivery means that circumvent the defense. In the case of India, they're deploying countermeasures and perhaps more missiles. In the case of Pakistan, I think defense suppression, maybe they'll get countermeasures from China, but defense suppression may be an interesting option for them, or they can deploy long-range cruise missiles. Do missile defenses destabilize or create incentives for preemptive attack? Possibly. That's another concern. The missile defense in India's hands could create incentives for India to preempt despite its no first use doctrine. I realize that the Indian no first use doctrine is a sincere commitment, but in the heat of war, I personally don't place too much stake on declaratory policy. But India has an incentive to attack only if it also has an effective counterforce capability. That is to say, it has some ability to destroy some fraction of Pakistan's nuclear force in a preemptive offensive attack, and then the defense handles the ragged retaliatory strike. If India has that defense and offense, then it does lead to first strike incentives in my mind. And certainly Pakistan would worry about that. But India is not the only country that has an incentive to preempt in this defense world. Pakistan may believe that it could cripple or destroy the Indian missile defense system with a preemptive defense suppression attack. So Pakistan, too, may feel a certain race to the button, not the nuclear button, not launching nuclear attack, but they may try to send special forces in, long-range cruise missiles with high explosives, an RPG through the face of one of those radars. One won't take out the radar, but 10 of them might, or a truck bomb parked next to that, one of those large early warning radars. So there are ways in which, both in terms of an arms competition, may set in motion, although one can argue about whether Pakistan has the capability to run this type of competition, and incentives for preemptive attack. So the bottom line is, in my mind, there are some interesting roles for defense. India, I think, legitimately is thinking about some of these. It's expensive. And there may be some destabilizing consequences that it behooves us to think through before we get too far down this road. With apologies to the chairman, I took a few extra minutes, but thank you very much.